My name is Josh Ober. I am in the classics department and also in the political science department here at Stanford. And I'd like to welcome everyone to the second of this year's Tanner Lectures in Human Values, which are sponsored by the Tanner Foundation and by the Office of the President of Stanford University, and organized by the McCoy Center for Ethics in Society. And just reiterate my thanks to all of those who have been involved with putting on this year's Tanner Lectures. It was a particular joy for me to introduce today's speaker, Danielle Allen, who is UPS Foundation Professor in the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. It's the other place in Princeton, as the people at Princeton University tend to think of it. President Hennessy yesterday gave a very full and nice introduction. In the course of that introduction, in which you heard about Danielle Allen's publications and some parts of her career, he mentioned that I have known Danielle for quite a while. In my first year of teaching, indeed, at Princeton University, which I'm horrified to think was nearly a quarter century ago, I offered a course in the history of Athenian democracy. Now, this was a fairly smallish class, and got to know the students pretty well pretty quickly. And I found that my lectures, such as they were frequently and very productively interrupted by this ferociously serious and fiercely intelligent young woman who constantly asked these sort of startlingly sophisticated and probing questions. And I thought, is this like a graduate student? Oh, I found out, she's a sophomore. And some of these questions, although at the time I thought I was something of an expert in the subject of democracy at Athens, I found I just couldn't answer. At least I couldn't answer them in the definitive sort of way that Danielle seemed to feel would be appropriate. I mean, after all, she had this kind of strange idea that professors at Princeton were supposed to know something about the subjects they were teaching. So she would ask these questions, and to one of these questions, which concerned the conditions under which imprisonment might be used as a punishment in and of itself, rather than just a means for detention of convicted criminals awaiting punishment. This had to do with Socrates and so on. After I'd given sort of the usual, the literary sources are not entirely clear on this, and there's quite a lot of scholarly debate, and then there's the archaeological evidence that blah, blah, blah. I finally sort of blurted out something along the lines of, well, why don't you just try to find out the answer for yourself? Well, she did, and the eventual result was a brilliant first book called The World of Prometheus, The Politics of Punishing in Democratic Athens. Danielle generously inscribed a copy of that book to me with the wish that we might share many more years of collaboration, a wish that so far has been fulfilled, and for my part, I trust that we've only just begun. I tell this story not only to establish my own proprietary claim to a small role in the dramatic narrative of Danielle's intellectual odyssey. It is to establish that claim, but not only just to establish that claim. Also, I tell it to underline what I see as her essential feature as a thinker and a scholar. And it is that for Danielle, scholarship, research, scientific investigation is a conversation. It's a conversation with true friends who are collaborators in the deep sense of being people who are building and sustaining lives together, lives dedicated to doing things that really matter, things including, but not limited to, asking and trying to answer really hard questions that currently lack satisfactory answers. Danielle's evident delight in conversation is driven by her ferocious seriousness. Yes, there's still that. but also by humor, by warmth, by an immense sense of caring for others. So while I seem to be introducing a lecture, or a lecturer, after all, this is the Tanner Lectures, right? I'm in fact in the much happier position, the more felicitous position of welcoming her and you back to an ongoing conversation that began yesterday evening with her discussion of two concepts of education, in which Danielle conjoined John Rawls' two concepts of rules, that is, rules at the level of social system and rules at the level of individual practice, with Hannah Arendt's notion of the human condition, a flourishing life, or as a flourishing life, live fully through appropriately developed capacities for productive labor, world-creating work, intimacy, and political action. The result was to establish a humanistic baseline that unites education and equality in quite a new and exciting way. The conversation continued in a spirited session this morning in which Harvard's Tommy Shelby pressed Danielle on the question of whether the perfectionism of her account could be squared with a pluralistic political liberalism in which the state remains neutral among competing conceptions of the good, and Marcelo Suarez Orozco of UCLA, who raised the question of how the issue of education, or the educación, of family and community life fits with or fails to fit with education in the schoolhouse, especially in an age of globalization. Well, the conversation continues tomorrow. You are all very cordially invited at 9 a.m. to the Oskenberg Room of Encina Hall, when Chiara Allegria Cudes from New York City and Michael Rebell from Columbia University will offer their comments on the second of Danielle Allen's talks on education and equality. They'll be commenting specifically on the lecture that we're about to hear on the topic of participatory readiness. So please join me in welcoming back to our conversation here in Nerd Nation of Danielle Allen.
So I tell that story differently. I have to say. And it's one of those great things about friendship. You sometimes find that you each have very different memories of various important moments in the friendship. And then there's the rare occasion when you discover that actually you have the same turning point memory, but you tell it differently. So my version of that story is, everybody always asks me, how did you end up as a class assist? And my answer is always, Josh Ober. And you can see why, given the kind of teacher and teaching presence that he is. And I always tell a story about, well, I took this class on Athenian democracy, and it was full of incredible ideas, and this teacher had just one of the most creative approaches to his subject that I'd seen any teacher have ever, and he was energetic and dynamic. And one day I asked a question in class about imprisonment in Athens. I mean, why didn't they use imprisonment? We used it in this sort of crazy and comprehensive way. Why didn't they use it? And his answer was, that would make a great dissertation topic. And so in my telling, there's nothing about the pesky undergraduate who's sort of pushing you to the edge with questions. No. My story is about the mentor who takes a young student and shows them what the next step in the process is for the thing that they're trying to do. And those mentors are so important to the development of every young student. So that's my version of the story. And thank you, Josh, for this moment, the continuing conversation, and its origins, which I do owe to you. So thank you. And one tiny technical question, which is there's not a clicker up here for the PowerPoint, which would make life a little easier if it were possible to have that. But while they're getting that, let me get us started with my epigraph. So to the Greeks, logos dynastes megas esten, hos mikrotati somati kai aphanistato theotata erga apotele. Speech is a great power which achieves the most divine works by means of the smallest and least visible form. So from a teacher of rhetoric named Gorgias in a speech defending Helen for having gone with Paris to Troy. Again, let me give you a roadmap for where we're going. I'm going to introduce the concept of participatory readiness. I'm going to explain how it's connected to equality. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Oh, it's got it. Okay. I'm going to ask the question, if we're going to talk about participatory readiness, what do we need to be ready for? That will lead me to an exploration of the content of participatory readiness, and then the means that we have available for cultivating it, and then a few modest words in conclusion. Are we good? Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Terrific. So, in my first lecture, I argue that our conversations about education are often muddled because we fail to distinguish two concepts of education. One that justifies the practice at a societal level, the second that justifies actual instances of particular teachers teaching particular students. Once we focus on these two concepts of education, we see that the latter establishes a humanistic baseline for the former. A social system designated as education, which may be justified and sustained for utilitarian reasons, like a society's global economic competitiveness, can retain that label only if the actual instances of teaching conducted within its ambit are responsive to the eudaimonistic pursuit of human flourishing that underlies all actual instances of teaching, properly understood. Rawls's conceptual tools allow us to switch back and forth between consideration of the social and the individual. This, the social versus the individual, is a better distinction, I think, than one between public and private goods or between the extrinsic and intrinsic goods of education. This is because the same phenomenon, for instance, the development of civic agents, can be considered either for its public good aspect, including its susceptibility to free riding, or for its private benefit. And there are, of course, not only intrinsic but also extrinsic benefits that flow to an individual from civic participation. Once we're prepared to consider education with regard to both a macro societal level and a micro level conception, we meet the question of whether it is possible to provide content for the humanistic baseline for education that harmonizes the two concepts. I made the case that by drawing on Hannah Arendt's account of basic human needs in the human condition, we can do that successfully. On the basis of her text, I argue that education needs to prepare all students in 4 ways: for breadwinning work, for civic and political engagement, for creative self-expression and world-making, for rewarding relationships in spaces of intimacy and leisure. The striking feature of this list of education's aims is that 2 of them identify goals that, considered from an alternative perspective, are also part of the common utilitarian social justifications for education. To say that each person needs preparation for non-exploitative breadwinning work is to consider the issue of societal economic well-being from the perspective of the individual rather than the social whole. Similarly, to say that everyone needs preparation for civic and political engagement is to consider the issue of civic engagement from the perspective of each student rather than the social system. When we put the Rawlsian and Arendtian perspectives together, we see that our public discourse about education, our articulations of our collective goals, routinely leave out the civic. We have seen that, for instance, according to the Common Core state standards, education must ensure all American students are prepared for the global economic workplace. That's the main focus there. And in general, the rhetoric of educational policy relies almost exclusively on advocating the goals of college and career readiness. The civic has, in short, gone AWOL. And this is true despite the fact that civic experience is important to both concepts of education, the social and the individual. My aim in pursuing the topic of participatory readiness is to rectify this. So what exactly is participatory readiness? First, the idea of being prepared to participate captures prospects of participation at several social levels, not only that of the political community, but also that of intimate and communitarian relationships. Think again of the 4 needs. Our flourishing as creators entails our engagement in cultural communities of meaning, and even our success in the realm of labor requires participation in social relationships. Participatory readiness defines our preparation for civic and political life, but it also undergirds our preparation in all the areas in which we hope to prosper. When young people leave school or college, we hope that they're prepared to participate effectively at work and in communities and in love. One might well want to pause on the question of what participatory readiness entails at the intimate or social level, particularly given the contemporary crisis around sexual assault on college campuses. But the question of what it means to participate well in civic and political life also merits our fulsome attention. The reason to prioritize this topic, despite the urgencies of the social pathologies of our campuses, is the centrality of this other topic to our political pathologies, in particular, the problem of inequalities of many kinds. Before I turn to the components of participatory readiness, then, and what we know about the kinds of education that can achieve it, I'd like to take a moment to expand on just how civic and political agency and their cultivation are relevant to our understanding of equality and any effort to address issues of inequality, however those are specified. So here we go to the connection to equality. The first link between a broad education for participatory readiness and equality is obvious. The idea that all students should be educated for political participation, and not merely a select few prepared for political leadership, as in Plato, is already an egalitarian feature of the humanistic baseline for education as I fleshed that out. In seeking to give content to the humanistic baseline for education, I describe myself as employing a democratic eudaimonism developed from Arendt. My embrace of democracy imported an ideal of political equality to the core idea of human flourishing that education supports. In other words, I follow Hannah Arendt and others in seeing a basic human need to participate in the realm of action as explaining why, among possible regime types, democracy is not only desirable, but also the most just. Given that, on this argument, political participation is necessary for a flourishing life, and given that education is preparation for a flourishing life, our curricula and pedagogies must then prepare people for the Arendtian life of action. The goal is to maximize participation and thereby to come closer to realizing an ideal of political equality, as well as providing to each individual the specific sense of fulfillment that accrues through the experience of empowerment. The aspiration and the micro-level concept of education to prepare students to participate in their communities and polities flows from and then in turn reinforces a commitment to political equality. The egalitarian significance of preparing all young people for civic and political life extends, however, beyond politics. It stretches to all those domains where it matters who makes the decisions that define our collective lives. This means that the value of participatory readiness embraces, for instance, even the realm of economics. Here we can return to the many scholars who propose education as the main remedy to income and wealth inequality. They are right to do so, but they do so for the wrong, or at least for a partial reason. Most arguments of this kind locate the egalitarian value of education in its potential to achieve broad dissemination of skills. Such broad dissemination is expected to drive down the wage premium on expertise and to help compress the distribution of income, the spread of the distribution of income. I am thinking again of Thomas Piketty's arguments, but also of the work of Claudia Golden and Larry Katz. On this line of thought, education is presumed to bring with it positional advantage. That is, those who have more education, more skills, can be presumed to reap more of the rewards of the marketplace. Narrowing gaps in the level of education that different segments of the population receive, or equalizing the distribution of educational goods, should then also reduce the positional advantage that accrues to education and reduce, for instance, income inequality. Rob Reich, your colleague and my co-editor of the volume Education, Justice, and Equality, I've got one here in case anybody's interested, has drawn my attention to the work of the economist Fred Hirsch on the idea of positionality. Hirsch quips, if everyone stands on tiptoe, no one sees any better. But we might also say, if everyone stands on tiptoe, then no one is too seriously overshadowed. But there are limits to how much the positional advantage of education can be moderated through the dissemination of technological skills. As the economist Daron Acemoglu and political scientist Jim Robinson have pointed out, arguments such as this presume a stable framework of technology and political institutions. They put this point particularly effectively when critiquing Piketty's account of income and wealth inequality. His argument fails, they propose, because it leaves politics out of the analysis. Thus, they write, the quest for general laws of capitalism, or any economic system, is misguided because it is institutional. It ignores that it is the institutions and the political equilibrium of a society that determine how technology evolves, how markets function, and how the gains from various different economic arrangements are distributed. Acemoglu and Robinson remind us that, for instance, Marx's predictions that capitalism would generate wage stagnation or a decline in the share of national income accruing to labor failed, at least in the case of the United Kingdom, because important British political reforms impacted wages and labor in the opposite direction. I quote again, for example, the Industrial Revolution went hand in hand with major political changes, including the development of the state and the Reform Acts, which changed British political institutions and the distribution of political power. The economic consequences of these political changes were no less profound. In 1833, a professional factory inspectorate was set up, which brought the real implementation of legislation on the regulation of factory employment. The Factory Act of 1847 was much more radical than previous measures, and it came at a time of intense social mobilization in the form of the Chartist movement. The political fallout of the 1832 democratization also led to the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, lowering the price of bread, raising real wages, and simultaneously undermining land rents. In other words, the nature of a society's political life intersects with its economic fate. In the case of the US, Acemoglu and Robinson highlight late 19th and early 20th century populist and progressive mobilizations that led to reductions of corporate power, a turn of events that also refuted one of Marx's general laws, they argue. The preparation of citizens for civic and political engagement supports the pursuit of political equality, but political equality, in turn, may well engender more egalitarian approaches to the economy. In other words, education can affect income inequality not merely by spreading technical skills and in compressing the spread of income distribution, it can even reduce income inequality by impacting how technology evolves, to quote Acemoglu and Robinson again, impacting how markets function and how the gains from various different economic arrangements are distributed. There are then multiple links between the idea of participatory readiness and the concept of equality. An education that prepares students for civic and political engagement, that, in short, achieves participatory readiness, brings not only a concept of political equality into play, but also the prospect of political contestation around issues of economic fairness. Insofar as technology frameworks and political institutions are malleable, the status of education as a positional good may itself not be stable. The degree of its positionality will in all likelihood vary with the political context. And insofar as an education for participatory readiness can affect the degree of political competitiveness in a society, it has the potential to drive changes in the positionality of education itself, as well as in its distribution. Consequently, the most valuable way for us to direct our educational system toward egalitarian ends may be by focusing on participatory readiness. When we think about equality in the context of education, we tend to think above all about distributional questions. We imagine that we will have an egalitarian system when we've managed to fund institutions that will genuinely offer the possibility of an equal level of attainment to all or nearly all students. But we may need to move the conversation one step back and to remind ourselves that fair economic outcomes may themselves depend on genuine political equality. If this is right, then an education for participatory readiness, and not merely for technical skill, is the appropriate way of understanding the linkage between pedagogy and equality. But if participatory readiness is so important, just what should students get ready for? In what do we expect them to participate? So let's ask that question. A basic challenge in answering the question of what students should get ready for is reflected already in a certain instability in our common vocabulary. Would we like to say that we should prepare them for civic engagement or for political participation? On this question, we are confused. Thus far in my lectures, I've repeatedly used the pleonastic phrase civic and political life, and this reflects what I take to be a broadly shared confusion. After all, don't those two words mean fundamentally the same thing? Their etymological roots are similar. Political and civic come respectively from the Greek and Latin terms for city. So why use both at once? Yet these terms have come for us to have two distinct rhetorical valences. Civic is a safe word. It suggests public action undertaken through approved venues and within the confines of long-standing public agendas. Political is a more highly charged term. It invokes approved actions such as voting and holding office, but it also brings with it a suggestion of protest action, activism, and advocacy, all of which make us nervous when we come to discussing things like curriculum and pedagogy. We don't, for instance, commonly think that a K-12 education or college education should be organized around teaching people Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals. Although I have recently been told that there's a very popular course at MIT called Theories of Revolution. So I'm not sure what it entails exactly, but Alinsky's text is one that does achieve participatory readiness for at least some kind or another. And whatever kind it is, we are more likely to call it an education in something political than in something civic. Our strange uncertainty around the term political came home to me with a special force when I had the occasion to watch the video of a recent panel that gathered together 3 young leaders of digital associations. These young people were engaged respectively in activities like support of marriage equality, the dissemination of Hayekian economic ideas, and claiming space in the public sphere for American Muslims. When asked whether they thought of themselves as political, each said no. This fact underscores the challenge of trying to define the content of an education for participatory readiness. We can't quite bring ourselves to agree on whether our object is the civic or the political, and this is partly because we no longer esteem the political. The lack of equilibrium in our vocabulary reflects the current absence of any single unified conception of what it means to participate in public life. To put our current situation in context with regard to conceptions of citizenship, it is helpful to take a historical view. The sociologist and communications scholar Michael Schudson, who's at Columbia, has made the important point that models of civic education in a given time and place tend to track whatever is the reigning ideology of citizenship. In the case of the US, he identifies 4 distinctive models of civic agency that have emerged at different points since the founding, each model emerging from the period's reigning ideals and each generating a different approach to the education of the young for political participation. In the early years of the US, politics was dominated, he argues, by a model of the citizen as a trusted, solid individual, a white male property owner whose central activity was to vote for esteemed leaders whose wise hands would guide the course of the community. The education of these citizens was primarily religious and directed toward matters of character. With the rise of populist politics and mass political parties, the citizen evolved into the party loyalist, an individual who turned out for party parades and events, voted for the slate, and reaped economic benefits like employment opportunities through party membership. The intellectual demands were minimal. Even literacy was not necessary to vote a party ticket. With the rise of the progressive era and the professionalization of political bureaucracies and journalism, the country saw the emergence of a model of the citizen as the informed voter. The citizen's main activity was still voting, but now that citizen was supposed to do that on the basis of having consumed high-quality information, particularly that provided by journalists. With the civil rights era came the model of the rights-conscious citizen. Individuals needed to become more self-aware about their own rights and more attentive to the rights of others. The courtroom and tactics like public litigation were added to the citizen's toolkit. I don't think it's possible to name a single model of citizenship that dominates our own age, but it should be possible to identify the handful of models that are bumping around and against each other in our collective imagination. To do this, it would be useful to take a step back again to a broader conceptualization of the nature of action in public life, so that we can consider which features of the experience of public action are currently captured in contemporary understandings of civic and political participation. Here I think Arendt's account of action can again be helpful. It's not merely that I admire her account, but also that it can serve as a backdrop against which to assess just how, in practice, we seem to conceive of political life these days. In Arendt's account of action, citizenship is the activity of co-creating a way of life. It is the activity of world building. The concept, fully understood, extends beyond legal categories of membership in political units. The activity of citizenship, of co-creation and world building, can occur at many different social levels, in a neighborhood or school, in a networked community or association, in a city-state or nation, or at a global level. As I further specify this idea of civic agency in my own work, it is multifaceted and involves 3 core tasks. First, there is disinterested deliberation around a public problem. Here, the model is the Athenian citizens gathered in the assembly, or the town halls of colonial or contemporary New Hampshire. Or their public representatives, also as examples of deliberators, who behave reasonably in the halls of a legislature. The second kind of core task is prophetic work, to shift a society's code of values. In the public opinion and communications literature, this is now called frame shifting. Think here of the rhetorical power of Harriet Beecher Stowe and Martin Luther King Jr. Finally, there's transparently and passionately interested, not disinterested, but interested, fair fighting, where a given public actor adopts a cause and pursues it passionately, never pretending to disinterestedness. One might think of the 19th century activists for women's rights, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Matilda Jocelyn Gage. The ideal civic agent combines capacities to carry out all 3 of these tasks ethically and justly. Let's take the 19th century women's rights activist, Elizabeth Stanton Cady, as an example. At the Seneca Falls Convention, she had to function in a deliberative mode for the debate about the text of the Declaration of Sentiments. She had, however, drafted that text in the first place, and in so doing had functioned in a prophetic mode. Finally, in campaigning for legal change, as she did for the adoption of the Woman's Property Bill in New York and similar laws in other states, she functioned as an activist. Yet if these 3 tasks, deliberation, prophecy, and contestation, are the rudimentary components of civic agency, they do not themselves answer the question of just what conception of citizenship pertains at any particular historical moment. There is no need for each of these functions to be combined in a single role or citizenly persona. It's altogether possible for these tasks to become separated from one another, generating distinguishable kinds of civic roles and types of civic agent. And I think that's the situation that obtains today. Distinct alternative roles and personae have developed that emphasize one or another of the 3 core tasks of civic agency, or some combination. There are the roles of the civically engaged individual. The League of Women Voters is a good example. The activist or political entrepreneur, think Occupy Wall Street, and the professional politician. Following Shudson's example, we can distinguish these roles by how they define the tasks of civic agency, by how they connect to the levers of power, and by the intellectual and psychological demands they make on their practitioners. The civically engaged individual focuses on the task of disinterested deliberations and actions that can be said to flow from it. Such citizens focus on pursuing universal values, disinterestedness, critical thinking, and bipartisan projects. Hence our use of the safe word civic for this category of civic agency. Next come the activist and the politician. They are political actors, and the unsafe and sometimes unsavory nature of the activity conducted through these second two roles explains our use of the word political for them. The activist seeks to change hearts and minds and to fight in the ideal fairly for particular outcomes, often making considerable sacrifices to do so. Finally, the professional politician, as currently conceived, focuses mainly on fighting, not necessarily on fighting fair. This role, in contrast to the other two, currently represents a degraded form of civic agency in contemporary discourse, and one has only to look at Congress's all-time low approval ratings to recognize this. So that's why it's fair for me to use Boehner, is because he's representative of Congress specifically. Anyway, each of these citizenly personae has some affinity with one of the models that Shudson analyzes as grounded in a particular historical era. The civically engaged individual has a close affinity with the progressive era's idealization of the informed voter, the activist or political entrepreneur with the civil rights era's rights-conscious citizen, and the politician with the late 19th century model of the party loyalist. Yet in our moment, all three of these models of civic agency, or updated versions of them, are bumping into and jostling one another in our public spheres. So given this fact, how do we educate for participatory readiness? Do we choose one of these models to emphasize? Or is there a way to integrate our understanding? All three of these citizenly roles include voting in their responsibilities. But beyond that institutional responsibility, these roles develop very different conceptions of how to interact both with formal institutions and with the other levers that can be pulled to effect change. They also develop very different conceptions of the types of speech and ethical orientations that should govern civic and political participation. Each of these citizenly roles also presupposes a different approach to the development of intellectual and psychological capacities. The civically engaged citizen, who embraces the ideal of disinterested deliberation and pursues projects of universal value, must, in some fashion, be clear about and counteract self-interest, must develop ways of testing whether things count as universal, and requires high-quality information on a wide array of issues, not just a single issue. The activist, who embraces an ideal of equitable efficacy, must be clear about interests and goals, must be good at strategic and tactical thinking, and understand the levers of change, must be good at techniques of storytelling that facilitate frame shifting, and must have ethical parameters for thinking about the relationship between means and ends. The professional politician in the ideal, as opposed to in contemporary reality, would have both sets of the above competencies, as well as having expertise at how political institutions themselves function. Notably, we've lost sight of the ideal citizen, who combines success at all three citizenly tasks. That is, we've lost sight of the statesman, who is a professional politician, but who nonetheless has developed all of the capacities described above as belonging to the other two roles, and so is capable of disinterested deliberation, of just frame shifting, and of fighting fair, as opposed to being capable merely of fighting. But even more importantly, we have also lost sight of the ordinary citizen, who is not a professional politician, but who has nonetheless developed all of these competencies, and who is proud to be involved in politics. If we are to embrace an education for participatory readiness, we need to aim our pedagogic and curricular work not at any single one of these three models, but at the more fundamental understanding about what politics is that lies behind them. As I've said, I embrace an Arendtian account of the political life as something positive and as consisting of the activity of co-creating a way of life. Ultimately, I think that this view of politics generates an account of participatory readiness that supports all three models of citizenship: the civically engaged individual, the activist, and the politician. It supports all three roles because each is carrying out only a subset of the work that constitutes public action. An education that prepares a student for Arendtian action should nourish future civic leaders, future activists, and future politicians. But such an education ought also to permit a reintegration of these role types. We might then choose either of two courses: either to direct an education for participatory readiness toward three distinctive citizenly personae simultaneously, or to direct that education towards some reintegrated concept of civic agency. Either way, it's an ambitious project and requires a much more expansive approach to civic education than I have yet seen an example of. So let's turn to the content of participatory readiness. What should be the content of an education for participatory readiness? An aspiration to answer this question is visible in the June 2013 report called The Heart of the Matter, released by the recent Commission on the Humanities and Social Sciences, established by Congress and organized by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. The report presented as its first goal the following. Goal 1, educate Americans in the knowledge, skills, and understanding they will need to thrive in a 21st century democracy. With this formulation, the Heart of the Matter report sought to rectify the gap in our public justification for the system of education by restoring a civic component. What is education for? It's for thriving in democracy, not merely a global economy, so the report argues. Then the Commission detailed the activities for which it thought students should ready themselves, drawing, among other sources, on the good work of Michael Rebell, the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. The Commission followed its goal statement with a recommendation. The Commission therefore recommends a new dedication to participatory readiness as an educational goal. We urge a nationwide commitment to preparing K-12 students for full participation in democratic society. The Commission commends the Common Core State Standards Initiative for its inclusion of history and civics in the basic literacy curriculum. It promotes the competencies necessary for full civic participation in American society, voting, serving on juries, interpreting current events, developing respect for and understanding of differences, along with the ability to articulate one's sense of the common good. The Commission adopted the language of participatory readiness, but in its account of the education that achieves this, limned a sketch of civic education largely as we have traditionally known it. The traditional conception focuses on instruction in history and civics, typically understood as classroom learning about the mechanics of government. This is conventionally described as the how a bill becomes a law approach to civic education. This is a model of education for informed citizenship or for dutiful citizenship, as the media scholar Lance Bennett calls it. Nonetheless, the Commission did modestly extend the basic civic education framework in two ways. It underscored preparation for interactions in conditions of diversity, as well as the development of linguistic competence adequate to offering up compelling visions of the public good. But for the most part, the traditional model of civic education is what comes through. In this model, participation is primarily through formal political institutions, and we should prepare ourselves for this. Yet in my view, the Commission, on which I need to confess that I served, did not go far enough in sketching a new vision for education for participatory readiness. There are two key problems with the vision as sketched. First, to focus on the mechanics of government as the heart of civic education is to focus on only a part of what is needed for the development of participatory readiness. Civic agents do need to understand the strategies and tactics available for turning bills into laws and for bringing about political change. The structure of political institutions is an important part of this, but this is only one of several components required. There are really three pillars to civic agency, not only tactical knowledge, but also verbal empowerment and democratic knowledge. I'll come back to both of those in a moment. Let me, though, indicate first, before I do that, the second problem with the how a bill becomes a law model. This second problem stems from the transformation of public spheres in our new media age, where once we needed to understand how to write letters to the editor or to Congress, now we need to understand the architecture and rhetorics of the internet and social media. To solve these two problems, then, we needed an account of each of the three pillars of civic agency, as well as a revised account of its tactical components. Onward, then, to each of the three pillars. Verbal empowerment consists of both interpretive and expressive skills. That's my dad and daughter, just in case you're wondering. Civic and political action must begin from a diagnosis of our current situation and move from that diagnosis to a prescription for response. Such interpretive work, or in the language of the Declaration of Independence, the work of reading the course of human events, can be done only in and through language. Data is only one subset of the linguistic resources available to this work of diagnosis and prescription. Conversational work is necessary to clarify the meaning of data, regardless of how big they are. The analytical skills that constitute acts of interpretation only ever manifest themselves in language, descriptions of the situation that obtains or of what is to be done. Moreover, success at the movement from diagnosis to prescription requires not merely the verbal skills embodied in acts of interpretation, but also expressive skills. For these social diagnoses to become effective, one must convince others of them. The verbal work involved in civic agency extends well beyond our usual focus on deliberation to include also adversarial and prophetic speech. This component of participatory readiness used to be taught from antiquity through the 19th century under the heading of rhetoric. Second, Participatory readiness requires what I call democratic knowledge. And here I build on work from Josh Ober and again continue the conversation. Democracy is an egalitarian political form, and one of its great paradoxes is that egalitarianism functions not by reducing or diminishing the need for leadership, but by increasing it. Democracies spawn vast numbers of collective decision-making bodies. The Athenians famously had a long list of boards of administrators and civic officers, many populated by lottery. As to our own case, during the period of the Revolutionary War, so this is a picture of the Committee of Five submitting a draft of the Declaration of Independence to Continental Congress. So in our own case, during the period of the Revolutionary War, scarcely a day went by when the Continental Congress did not yet set up yet more committees to carry out congressional business. Tocqueville, of course, noticed how prolific 19th century Americans were at forming associations, and for all of Robert Putnam's tales of 20th century decline and bowling alone, we actually continue to be very busy in this regard. Our forms of association have changed, certainly, and for very good reasons, among them that the law of association was fundamentally restructured in this country between 1970 and 1990, but it is by no means clear that associations are any less common now than at earlier points. All this associating generates its own science and demands its own art form. Call these simply the science and art of association. I call this science and art taken together democratic knowledge, because they pinpoint bodies of knowledge that grow up specifically in democratic contexts. While there are many components to this science and art of association, I consider among the most important to be its relational elements. On this front, democratic knowledge consists of what I call cosmopolitan bonding skills on the one hand, and bridging skills on the other. The latter is easier to understand. These bridging skills consist of the capacities by which a translator, a mediator, and an individual who can surmount social difference can convert a costly social relationship into one that is mutually beneficial to both parties. Cosmopolitan bonding skills, in contrast, relate to the precise nature of the bonds that we form with the people to whom we feel the most affinity, whether that is because of shared kinship, geographical collocation, ethnicity, religion, or similarity of preferences. For the sake of healthy psychological development, all people need bonding relationships, but not all bonding relationships are the same. We need to bond in ways that help to preserve the democracy of which we are a part. Indeed, the question of how we bond is deeply entangled with the question of whether we are able to bridge. Thus, the critical question for a democratic society is how we can bond with those who are like us so as to help us bridge even with those who differ from us. In order for any method of bonding, for instance, that which begins from social homogeneity or that which begins from interest affinity, to support our capacity to bridge, the very experience of bonding must cultivate receptivity toward the potential of participation in our bonding group by social dissimilars. The question of just what sorts of styles and methods of social bonding can paradoxically also be cosmopolitan in this way is a difficult one, which I won't address in this lecture in full. Suffice it for our purposes simply to mark out the terrain by identifying this, too, as a core component of participatory readiness. Both cosmopolitan bonding skills and bridging skills are necessary for civic actors to function effectively across political institutions and other spaces for political action. They are also necessary for the formation of the solidarity that supports civic and political action outside of institutions. Finally, verbal empowerment and the acquisition of democratic knowledge require supplementation by tactical and strategic understanding, or knowledge of the mechanics of political action. As I've said, we have thought about this tactical part of civic education as requiring lessons in how a bill becomes a law. But a feature of our new media age is that the levers of change outside of political institutions are now easier to pull. Consequently, tactical and strategic understanding now also requires learning about how civic agents can interact with corporations and non-governmental organizations, or as part of social movements. It requires understanding how cultural norms can be changed and how changes in cultural norms bring about broader political changes. It fundamentally requires understanding a new architecture of communication. We still have a curricular and pedagogic need for the traditional focus of civic education on the Constitution and structure of government, but this domain of strategies and tactics now requires expansion. Here then are what I would identify as the core elements of participatory readiness: verbal empowerment, strategic and tactical understanding of the levers of political change broadly conceived, and acquisition of democratic knowledge. This is a non-exhaustive account of the elements of participatory readiness, but these are, I think, the most significant human capacities that require cultivation if each of us is to be well prepared to function as a civic and political actor. So, how could we actually get about the business of cultivating participatory readiness. For the rest of my lecture, I'll focus on the relationship between participatory readiness and verbal empowerment, for here we will find that the humanities are the unlikely hero of my story. We will also finally see the significance of recognizing the humanistic baseline that defines the concept of education as it pertains to the actual teaching of actual students. Here and there in the vast universe of educational data, one can catch fleeting glimpses of an answer to the question of how participatory readiness can be cultivated. For instance, it's clear that college does provide something to this end that our K-12 system generally does not. As Mira Levinson and others have pointed out, educational attainment is a better predictor of the likelihood of voting than even income. In other words, although we don't talk terribly often or in very consistent ways about how college provides a civic and political education, something is happening on our campuses that does engender participatory readiness. Importantly, that something is not simply the preparation of students for economic success. This is the importance of the fact that there is a closer correlation between level of educational attainment and likelihood of voting than even between socioeconomic status and likelihood of voting. There is also an important corollary to the observation that college makes a meaningful difference for participatory readiness. If those who have advanced degrees vote more than those with college degrees, and those with college degrees more than those with high school degrees, we have what Mira Levinson has called a civic achievement gap. This means we're not doing well enough in the K-12 system in cultivating participatory readiness. Yet if the goal of an educational system is to achieve participatory readiness for all students, this is an element of our education that we should hope to bring to satisfactory level by age 18, the age of political majority. So what exactly is happening on college campuses then, and not in the K-12 system, that makes this kind of difference? Not all college is the same, of course, and this fact holds an important key. Students have varying experiences depending, among other things, on their choice of major. Interestingly, there's a statistically significant difference between the rates of political participation that we see from those who have graduated with humanities majors and those who graduate with STEM majors. Similarly, participation in social science college curricula is a strong predictor of later political participation, according to political scientist Sunshine Hillygus, who earned her PhD here at Stanford, so we can count on her research credentials. Hillygus conducted the study to control for the possibility of self-selection of those with civic and political interests into social science courses, and even with this control in place, she found an effect on later political participation from enrollment in social science courses. Her paper provides strong evidence for a correlation between work in the humanities and social sciences and participatory readiness. And just as there is a difference between different educational strands in higher education, the same is true for K-12 education. Just as those who major in the humanities and in social science courses in college are more likely to participate politically after graduation, so too those with verbal skills that are higher by the end of high school, as measured by SATs, are more likely to become active political participants than those with high math scores. And this is also from the Hillygus article, so I can give you the citation if it's not there. The SAT effect endures even when college-level curricular choices are controlled for. Okay. To identify a correlation is not, of course, to identify causation, but it is clearly the case that those with more sophisticated verbal skills are more ready to be civic and political participators. This may be because another source of motivation engaged them in politics, and then once they were engaged, these students sought the verbal skills that they needed to thrive in the domain of political participation. Or perhaps the verbal ability made it easier to engage in the first place. We don't have a study that considers levels of engagement before and after significant increases in verbal ability. Nonetheless, what we do have in data such as this is tantalizing suggestions that the work of the humanities on verbal empowerment is intrinsically related to the development of participatory readiness. Explaining just how is an important and largely unaddressed research question. In addition to the data points that one can find scattered here and there as tantalizing clues to a profound story about the humanities, language, and participatory readiness, one can also find the occasional anecdote that helps elucidate the connection between language and civic agency. In a volume called Citizenship Across the Curriculum, Rebecca Nowacek, an English professor, relates the following story about the discovery by one humanities student of how her major had distinctively prepared her to participate in public life. Nowacek writes, "Early in the collaborative process of working with two classmates on the knotty local problem of school choice within Milwaukee Public Schools, an English major told me she felt that the value of her disciplinary knowledge was questioned, even slighted. One of her group mates was a political science major, well versed in questions of public policy. The other was a speech pathologist with experience working in the local schools. What could someone who sits reading novels bring to their collaborative inquiry? Whether their skepticism was real or only imagined, the English major felt the need to articulate for her groupmates and for herself what her studies of literature had prepared her to contribute to the understanding of this knotty local problem. Ultimately, she determined that what she could contribute to her group was her capacity to identify and tease out the significance of patterns in discourse. She conducted a careful reading of local newspaper coverage of school choice, identifying a number of disturbing trends. This English major's heightened linguistic sensitivity was her special skill. My contention here is that it is also the foundational civic competency. It's the English major who was in a position to diagnose what was actually happening in the community and the meanings of how particular choices were being framed. We see her interpretive skills at work. We also see her expressive skills. She felt the need to articulate what her studies of literature had prepared her to contribute. And in response to this need, she was able to develop and express a memorable answer, memorable enough that her instructor recorded it. The anecdote is too partial for us to know just what political meaning the English major found in the newspapers, to know precisely how she contributed to the world-making in which she was engaged alongside the political science and the speech pathology majors. Yet we do see in this anecdote a deployment of the first political skill, diagnosis. Notably, reading novels, interpreting them, was what had prepared this student for her own life of action, in the Arendtian sense. This investigation of the relationship between the humanities, verbal empowerment, and participatory readiness is nothing more than a suggestive gesture toward precisely how we might cultivate participatory readiness. If indeed verbal empowerment is at the base of political empowerment, and if indeed the humanities have a special impact there, then we have a case for the humanities in their potential to contribute to participatory readiness. I have, in other words, in these lectures, in my pursuit of the links between education and equality, wandered into a defense of the humanities. This is because of the importance of education to the potential achievement of political equality, a potentiality that depends, I suggest, first and foremost on the humanistic components of the curriculum. To conclude these lectures, though, I'd like to complete these thoughts about the relationship between education and equality. The link that I have suggested among the humanities, language, and participatory readiness brings us to what I think is at the heart of education's egalitarian force. Education's most fundamental egalitarian value is in its development of us as language-using creatures. Our linguistic capacities are what, fundamentally, education taps, and it is their great unfolding that empowers students. This verbal empowerment prepares us for participation in civic and political life. As we cultivate verbal empowerment in our students, we build the foundations for a politically competitive social and political system. We have good reason to expect that in a genuinely competitive political system, matters of economic fairness would come under contestation. This returns us to the idea that by supporting political equality, educational institutions can themselves affect how technology evolves, how markets function, and how the gains from various different economic arrangements are distributed. The idea is that there ought to be a developmental threshold, identified in my account as the cultivation of participatory readiness, that enables human beings to compete politically even with others who have achieved a higher level of educational attainment. The fundamental relationship between education and equality, then, is that the very definition of education rests on a conception of shared human capacities which, when fully activated, have the potential, by supporting political equality, to move us toward a world that reduces or eliminates the positional aspect of the good of education itself. Consequently, the most valuable way for us to direct our educational system toward egalitarian ends may be by focusing on participatory readiness. Finally, I would suggest that it is perhaps because we have lost sight of the contributions made by the humanities to our educational system that we have also lost sight of the fundamental link between education and equality that I have tried to clarify in these lectures. So let me now provide a brief conclusion, a more formal conclusion. So let me return to the epigraph with which I started. Speech is a great power which achieves the most divine works by means of the smallest and least visible form. The great beauty of language's power as a catalyst of human capacity is that we all have access to it. So any of us can choose anywhere, anytime, to plumb its depths and climb with it to the heights of human achievement. An adequately egalitarian educational system would maximally activate the latent capacities in the powerful, invisible body of language which dwells inside each of us. Even when an educational system fails us, we still have access to self-development. We can educate ourselves, and many have. Before the arrival of compulsory education, there were Benjamin Franklin, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony. After its arrival, there were the participants in the freedom schools in the South in the summer of 1964. When we strip our idea of education of the state apparatus, that is, of the system level concept, we see again that what remains is what I've been calling the humanistic baseline. The idea that education begins as an effort to unfold the powers that mark us as human, the first of which is language, an effort that any of us can undertake in any social circumstance in which we find ourselves. In this fact, we come back to a fundamental human equality and also to the political equality that language opens up as a possibility for us. We come back to the capacity for world-making through political contestation, prophecy, and art that is latent in our linguistic power. And we come back to the possibility that the cultivation of participatory readiness leads to political institutions that will themselves pull towards social equality and economic fairness. Thank you.